Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Richard Coleman was one of those men everyone admired and envied. CEO of Coleman Industries, a construction and real estate development empire, he regularly graced the covers of business magazines. His successes seemed limitless: skyscrapers in Manhattan, luxury cars lined up like trophies in his garage, and a never-empty order book. Everyone saw him as the embodiment of success. But behind this veneer of perfection, the truth was far more fragile. Since the untimely death of his wife, Jessica, Richard had taken refuge in work. Every contract signed, every meeting completed, every new project was a way for him to ignore the emptiness in his home and his life. He hadn't just lost a loving wife, he'd lost his sense of direction, his connection, the warmth of home. And in this frantic race to build an empire, he hadn't seen his only son, Ethan, grow up. Ethan was 5 years old. A little boy with a bright smile, despite weakness in his legs that forced him to walk with crutches. His zest for life was intact, but his days were silent and solitary. While Richard busied himself with meetings and business dinners, Ethan spent his time with Maria Alvarez, the housekeeper. Maria wasn't just an employee, she had become the little boy's mother figure. Maria had arrived from Mexico several years ago, seeking stable employment to support her family back home. But she quickly grew attached to Ethan as if he were her own son. She accompanied him to his medical appointments, supported him in his daily exercises, and told him stories every night to ease his grief. While Richard believed money could solve everything, Maria knew what Ethan needed was a father. Richard, on the other hand, believed he was doing the right thing. He hired the best doctors, paid for the most expensive therapies, and paid for the most exquisite toys. But he didn't know that his son's smiles weren't bought with money, and that his apologies didn't make up for years of absence. That late summer evening, as the sun slowly set behind the Manhattan skyscrapers and bathed the garden of his villa in a golden light, Richard felt a strange, almost instinctive urge. He cut short a meeting, declined a potentially multi-million-dollar business dinner, and made an unusual decision: to go home early. Not late at night, when everyone was already asleep, but early enough to see his son awake. What he would discover in his own backyard that evening would forever change his outlook on life and success. For he would come to understand that true wealth is not measured in skyscrapers or luxury cars, but in the strength of a brave little boy and the tenderness of a woman who had cared for him when his own father was unable to. Richard Coleman rose before dawn, as he did every day. The sun was still a pale halo behind the Manhattan skyscrapers, and the city was still asleep. In his vast 45th-floor apartment, surrounded by designer furniture and expensive contemporary paintings, he was having breakfast alone, black coffee and a croissant. Everything seemed perfect, but a heavy silence filled the room. His phone was already buzzing, a reminder for an 8 a.m. meeting with the board, followed by a business lunch, then an endless series of site visits and meetings with investors. Richard swallowed his coffee without really tasting it. In his mind, there was only one priority: to continue building, to succeed, to accumulate what he believed would prove his worth. Meanwhile, a few miles away, Ethan was already awake. Maria Alvarez, loyal and gentle, had begun her morning routine. She helped the little boy put on his leg cast and adjust his crutches. Each gesture was made patiently, with a mixture of authority and tenderness. Ethan winced slightly as he leaned on his crutches, but Maria whispered encouragement. "You'll make it today, my brave one." Ethan smiled weakly. Despite his physical weakness, he refused to let his legs slow him down. For him, every morning was a challenge and every small step a triumph. Maria then led him through his exercises, repeated, sometimes painful movements that were always necessary to strengthen his legs. At school, Ethan was surrounded by other children playing and running freely. But he always stood a little apart, his crutches separating him from them. The other children didn't really understand, and he'd gotten used to it. Maria stayed by his side until the bell rang, ensuring he was never alone, that he always had someone to encourage and protect him. Richard, on the other hand, didn't know any of this. In his luxury car, he sped through Manhattan, talking on the phone with his partner. Deals rolled in, numbers scrolled across his phone screen, but deep down, a feeling of emptiness began to creep in. He had everything, except what he wanted most, to be a father to Ethan. That evening, after a day of endless meetings and fierce negotiations, Richard returned home. But unlike usual, he felt a strange impulse. He wanted to see his son awake. He wanted, for once, to cross the threshold of the house and not be a stranger to the boy he loved but had barely known. In the garden, Maria watched Ethan as he worked hard, his crutches planted in the grass, his face focused but smiling. What she didn't know was that tonight, Richard would be crossing that garden for the first time in years, and that every step he took toward his son would be a step toward redemption and true wealth. Morning was dawning gently over the Coleman's villa. The sun's rays streamed through the large bay windows and caressed the still damp grass in the garden. Ethan, sitting on his small bench, was already practicing walking with his crutches, under Maria's watchful eye. "Come on, my champion, one step at a time," Maria whispered to him, her warm hand supporting the child's small shoulder. Ethan winced slightly. His legs burned sometimes, especially after his morning exercises, but he gritted his teeth and pressed on. His movements were hesitant, sometimes clumsy, but he never fell without trying to get back up. Maria watched him with pride. She knew his resilience better than anyone. "You know, Maria, I want to run one day," Ethan said with a small, tired smile. Maria smiled back and gently rubbed his cheek. "And you will run, Ethan. But you have to take it slow. Every effort counts." After the exercises, Maria prepared breakfast. Ethan sat at the large kitchen table, his crutches propped against the wall. He looked out the window at the flowers in the garden, a hint of sadness crossing his face. His father, Richard, was often away, and although Ethan loved him deeply, he didn't understand why this man, his father, never spent time with him. "Do you think Dad will be home tonight?" he asked, nervously knitting his fingers. Maria hesitated for a moment. She knew Ethan still hoped for moments with his father, but the reality was cruel. "I don't know, my darling," she replied softly. "But even if he doesn't come, I'm here, and I love you." Ethan nodded and focused on his bowl of cereal. Maria knew those words weren't always enough, but they created a bridge between them, a space where Ethan felt safe. Later that morning, Maria accompanied Ethan to his special needs school. The other children were playing freely, running around the yard, laughing and shouting. Ethan, on crutches, moved cautiously. A few curious glances landed on him, but he wasn't intimidated. He moved at his own pace, a brave little boy in a world where everything seemed to require more effort. "Don't forget, my champion," Maria said, watching him walk through the school gates, "I'll come and get you after class." Ethan smiled and waved at her, before disappearing among the other children. Maria stood for a moment, her eyes fixed on the child's figure. She knew that this fragile but brave little boy was the true light in the Coleman household, a light that not even Richard's money could buy. Meanwhile, Richard, oblivious to these daily scenes, continued his day of meetings and financial decisions. Every figure, every contract was a professional victory, but nothing filled the emptiness he felt deep inside. And tonight, he was going to make an unexpected choice. That day, Richard Coleman had flown from meeting to meeting like a robot. Every contract signed was a victory over the competition, every deal finalized reinforced his image as an unyielding, brilliant CEO. Yet, as the afternoon wore on, a feeling of unease settled in his chest, like a silent alarm he'd never taken the time to heed. Sitting in his glass-enclosed office overlooking Manhattan, he watched the skyscrapers bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Everything seemed perfect, the city shimmered before his eyes, the phone was silent for a rare minute, and yet, an immense emptiness filled him. He thought of Jessica, of her smile, of the gentleness of her gestures, and suddenly, he felt an irreparable loss. Then his mind drifted to Ethan. He vaguely remembered his son's face, his chuckles and curious eyes. But how many times had he missed his evenings, his birthdays, his first steps? Richard felt a pang of guilt tug at his heart. He had thought that by paying the best doctors and hiring the most devoted housekeeper, he was making up for his absence. But that evening, he understood, with brutal clarity, that money could not replace the love, the presence, the tenderness of a father. He stood up and paced his office. He remembered every failed smile, every ignored question, every hug he'd allowed Maria to offer Ethan. And the more he thought about his son, the bigger the emptiness seemed to grow, like a chasm he'd fallen into without even realizing it. Suddenly, his phone buzzed. A message from his secretary reminded him of a crucial meeting with investors for a multi-million-dollar project. Richard looked up and made an unusual decision: he wouldn't come. The contract could wait. The money could wait. But Ethan couldn't wait for his father to one day decide to take an interest in him. He closed his computer, grabbed his coat, and left his office. For the first time in years, he didn't think about profits, projects, or his reputation. He thought only of his son, of Maria, of the family he had let slip away. Driving through the streets of Manhattan, Richard felt a strange nervousness. He had spent his life being in control of everything, controlling every detail of his empire. But now, he was in control of nothing that really mattered. He wondered if he would ever be able to reconnect with his son, to repair what he had neglected for years. That night, for the first time in a long time, Richard realized a truth he had always refused to accept: material success was fleeting, but human connections were eternal. And in a few hours, he would walk through the front door of his house to face that truth, in front of Ethan and Maria, who were unknowingly waiting for him. The sun was setting behind the Manhattan skyscrapers, casting a soft golden glow over the city. Richard Coleman, driving his car, felt an unusual nervousness creeping over him. His usually steady hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. He wasn't late for a business meeting, nor caught up in a crucial negotiation. No, tonight he was driving home, for the first time in years, at a time when his son might still be awake. Each red light seemed to last an eternity. Memories of his absences, of missed birthdays, of nights Ethan waiting for him alone in his bed, hit him with painful intensity. He wondered how he could have been so blind, how he could have believed that money and success would be enough to fill the void left by his wife and his absence from his son. As he approached the villa, his heart beat faster. The massive gate opened automatically, and he stepped into the driveway lined with neatly trimmed trees. The house, with its lights on and open shutters, looked like a jewel box, but Richard felt there was a distance within it that no amount of wealth could fill. In the garden, he spotted Ethan. The little boy was practicing with his crutches on the lawn, still damp with dew. Maria, at his side, guided him gently and patiently, as always. Richard paused for a moment, simply to watch them. Ethan was focused, courageous despite his fatigue, and Maria, true to her role as protector and guide, watched over him like a second mother. A mixture of admiration and guilt washed over Richard. He had thought he was being a father by sending money and hiring experts to help Ethan, but he had never imagined he would miss what mattered most: presence, support, and love. Tonight, he realized that all the money in the world could never replace these simple moments, these shared moments in everyday life. He got out of the car. His steps, usually confident and assured in office corridors and on construction sites, were heavy in the garden. Ethan looked up at him, intrigued by this advancing figure, different from the faces he usually saw. Maria watched silently, recognizing the gait of the man who had been absent for so long, but sensing a strange tension in the air. Tonight, something was going to change. Richard stopped a few meters from his son. His hands were shaking, not from fatigue or cold, but because he felt that every step he took toward Ethan was a step toward redemption and true wealth. Ethan, for his part, didn't yet know that tonight, the face he rarely saw would finally smile at him, speak, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, be there for him. Richard walked slowly across the lawn, each step measured as if to avoid interrupting the fragile moment unfolding before him. Ethan, intent on his exercises with his crutches, didn't notice his father at first. Maria, faithful to her role as guide and protector, remained a few steps behind, ready to intervene if necessary, but aware that this was a moment she could not influence. "Ethan," Richard whispered, his voice trembling but soft. The little boy looked up and met the gaze of this man he knew so little about. There was something new in Richard's eyes, a vulnerability, a tenderness Ethan had never seen before. The boy stepped back slightly, wary, as if to gauge whether this father, finally here, was real or just a mirage. Maria sensed the emotion in the air and stepped back slightly, leaving the two alone. Richard knelt down to Ethan's eye level. I came home early tonight, he began, his voice trembling. I want to spend time with you. Ethan didn't answer immediately. His eyes shone with curiosity mixed with hesitation and suspicion. He had waited years for his father's gestures and words, and he didn't know if this moment was sincere. Richard gently extended his hand, as if inviting Ethan to take a step toward him. The little boy hesitated again, then, under Maria's watchful eye, he slowly stepped forward. His crutches clicked on the lawn, but he found the strength to approach. Richard felt an immense weight lift when Ethan placed his hand in his. This simple touch, so late but so meaningful, brought out an emotion he hadn't felt in a long time, the pure happiness of being a father. Dad. Ethan whispered, almost inaudible. Richard nodded, his eyes misty with tears he refused to let fall. He let his gaze roam over his son's face, noting every expression, every little detail he'd missed all these years. Then, gently, Richard suggested. Do you want me to help you with your exercises tonight? Ethan nodded tentatively. Richard supported his shoulders, encouraged him, and walked beside him into the garden. Each step was a small triumph for the boy, but also for the father, who was rediscovering his place in his son's life. Maria watched the scene with tears in her eyes, aware that this moment marked the beginning of a new era for this family. She had always known that Richard could love, that he could be there for Ethan. But tonight, she saw that change come to fruition, tangible, moving, and pure. For the first time in years, Richard fully realized what it meant to be a father. Not through gifts or contracts, but through presence, attention, and tenderness. The real treasure wasn't in his bank accounts or his buildings, but in this brave little boy and in the bond he had just begun to rebuild. After helping Ethan into the garden, Richard sat down on a bench, letting his son catch his breath. The little boy leaned on his crutches, his cheeks slightly flushed with exertion and excitement. The silence that fell wasn't heavy, on the contrary, it was filled with a new emotion, fragile but profound. Maria stayed back, respecting this intimate moment between father and son. She knew that talking wasn't enough to create a bond. Sometimes, simply being present, sharing a space, could be enough to rebuild what had been lost. Richard looked at Ethan, his eyes searching for the right words. He had spent years talking in numbers, contracts, strategic decisions, but here, in this garden, none of those words were of any use. You practiced a lot today, he said finally, his voice trembling. I'm proud of you. Ethan looked at him, surprised. He wasn't used to hearing those kinds of words from his father. His lips trembled slightly, and a shy smile appeared on his face. Thank you, Dad, he whispered. Richard felt a mixture of happiness and guilt. Those words, simple and sincere, carried the full weight of the lost years. He wanted to make up for everything, but he knew it would take time. I want to help you get stronger, Richard continued hesitantly. If you want, we can do the exercises together tomorrow. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. It was a small gesture, but to him, it meant his father truly wanted to be there, not just physically, but in his role as a father. Maria approached quietly, a discreet smile on her lips. I think you two have a lot to say to each other, even without words, she said, observing the budding connection. Richard nodded gratefully. For the first time, he understood that love couldn't be commanded or paid for. It was built in those simple, silent moments of gestures, attention, and presence. Ethan, sensing his father's sincerity, moved closer. He placed his free hand on Richard's, a simple gesture yet filled with trust and tenderness. Richard gently squeezed his fingers, aware that he had just crossed an important threshold, the one where forgiveness and love could begin to fill the years of absence. That first silent conversation, punctuated by smiles and glances, marked the beginning of a fragile but real rapprochement. Richard knew that a single evening would not be enough to repair everything, but he felt that this first step was the most important. That evening, in the garden bathed in the light of dusk, the Coleman family began to rebuild, one small step at a time. The next morning, Richard rose with unusual determination. Meetings and files could wait. Today, he was going to spend time with Ethan, and nothing was to come between them. He chose a simple outfit, leaving aside the impeccable suit for which he was renowned, and got into his car to meet his son at school. Maria was already waiting for him and Ethan outside the school gates. The little boy ran to his father, his crutches wobbly, but his smile lit up his face. Richard bent down to help him adjust his crutches, feeling a new warmth in his chest. "Ready for your afternoon, champ?" he asked, smiling shyly. Ethan nodded enthusiastically. That simple word, accompanied by his father's tangible presence, was enough to erase some of the distance that had accumulated over the years. They returned home, and Richard decided to follow Maria through Ethan's daily routine. He helped her prepare snacks, accompanied her through her rehabilitation exercises, and even shared a playdate in the garden. Every gesture, every smile, every encouragement strengthened the bond they were beginning to rebuild. "See, Dad?" Ethan said, placing his hands on the crutches. "I can walk a little further today." Richard nodded, his eyes shining. "Yes, I see that, and I'm very proud of you, Ethan. You're incredibly brave." Maria watched, moved. She knew it took time for trust and affection to grow, but she could already see that Richard was making a sincere effort to be involved in his son's life. Later, over a small impromptu meal in the kitchen, Richard engaged Ethan in conversation. He listened intently to every word, asking questions about his daily life, his friends, and even his minor frustrations. For the first time, Ethan felt that his father truly wanted to know him. "You know, Dad, I'd like you to come to my doctor's appointments," Ethan said shyly. Richard smiled, a mixture of pride and determination in his eyes. "I promise, my son. I'll come with you, and we'll do everything together." Evening was falling gently, and as they walked back into the living room, Richard felt a new sense of satisfaction. He knew this was only the beginning, that every step must be followed by another, but for the first time, he felt he could right the wrongs of the past. That day marked the first concrete step toward reconciliation. Richard understood that true wealth lay not in buildings, cars, or contracts, but in the time, attention, and love he could give his son. And, for the first time in years, he felt complete. A few days later, as a light rain fell across Manhattan, Richard decided to tidy up the office his late wife, Jessica, had loved so much. Among piles of files and contracts, he came across a small, delicately engraved wooden box he had never opened. His heart raced. He recognized Jessica's handwriting on the attached note. "For Richard, when you're ready to see what really matters." With a trembling hand, Richard opened the box. Inside, he discovered letters and a notebook, Jessica's intimate mementos. In these pages, she recounted her hopes for their family, her dreams for Ethan, and her desire that Richard never let money replace love. Each word vibrated with emotion and truth, as if she were speaking to him from beyond. One letter particularly caught his attention. "Richard, I know you work to give us the world, but our world is here, in Ethan's laughter, in the simple moments you share. Never forget that wealth is not what you have, but what you share." Richard felt a lump form in his throat. For years, he had believed he was honoring his wife by building an empire. But Jessica, through those words, showed him that he had missed the essential, being there, being a father, being a man within his family. He read and reread these pages, each word resonating in his heart, each sentence awakening in him a desire to repair, to rebuild what he had neglected. He understood that love, patience, and presence were the most important foundations, the ones that no skyscraper or contract could ever replace. That evening, Richard sat in the living room, Jessica's notebook in hand, and thought about how he could change his life. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The years of separation had driven a wedge between him and Ethan, but for the first time he felt the determination and strength to bridge it. Maria entered, seeing him deep in thought. "Richard, are you okay?" she asked softly. Yes, no, I mean. I just realize a lot of things, Maria, he said, nodding. Jessica was right. I put money before everything, and I almost forgot the most important thing. Maria smiled, acknowledging the change she had been waiting for so long. She knew that reading the notebook had awakened a new awareness in Richard, and that tonight marked a turning point in her life and Ethan's. For the first time in years, Richard understood that love and family were true wealth, and that every gesture, every moment shared with Ethan would now be more precious than all the contracts and buildings in the world. The following weeks were a learning curve for Richard. Every day, he resolved to become more involved in Ethan's life. Meetings and contracts no longer took priority. He understood that the time spent with his son could only be recouped through sincere and continuous presence. In the mornings, he walked Ethan to school, adjusted his crutches, and shared light conversations or bursts of laughter with him. He was learning to listen, truly listen, without interrupting or correcting, simply giving Ethan the attention he had so desperately missed. After school, Richard participated in the rehabilitation exercises, following Maria's guidance, who watched with pride and discretion. He guided his son, gently correcting his movements, and every small improvement Ethan made was a personal victory for him, as much as the successes he had achieved in the business world. One day, while they were playing in the garden, Ethan stopped and looked at his father with unusual seriousness. "Dad, you're staying with me, right?" he asked, a little hesitant. Richard placed his hand on Ethan's and squeezed it gently. "Yes, my son. I will never leave you alone again," he replied with palpable emotion. Maria, witnessing this moment, felt that the bond was truly strengthening. She saw Richard changing, not only for Ethan, but for himself, as if he were discovering a dimension of his life that he had always ignored, that of unconditional love and emotional responsibility. The evenings were now filled with laughter and games. Richard told Ethan made-up stories, just as his wife used to do, and every night he took the time to tell him how proud he was of him, how much he loved him. These words, simple but sincere, built a bridge between father and son, a bridge that seemed indestructible. Little by little, Ethan opened up more. He shared his joys, his frustrations, his dreams. Richard learned to respond with patience and encouragement, and he understood that a child's education could not be measured by material results, but by the support, presence, and love that one offers them. One evening, as they were finishing the exercises in the garden, Ethan turned to Richard and said, "Dad, I'm glad you're here." Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. To him, those words were worth more than any contract or building. He had finally understood that his true success lay not in the empire he had built, but in the precious and fragile bond he was rebuilding with his son every day. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt complete. Not because he had everything, but because he had found what had always mattered, his family, his son, and the love he had never stopped feeling for them. Spring was approaching, and with it, a sense of renewal in the Coleman villa. The trees were budding, colorful flowers illuminated the garden, and a new light shone in the house, that of love and renewed presence. Richard, Ethan, and Maria had gradually established a new routine, based on complicity, tenderness, and shared time. One evening, as the sun set and the sky turned orange, Richard and Ethan sat on the garden bench. Ethan, tired but happy after his exercises, rested his head on his father's shoulder. "Dad," he said softly, "I love you." Richard felt a warmth rush through him and replied, his voice choked with emotion. "Me too, my son. Me too." Maria, watching the scene from the terrace, smiled proudly. She knew the road had been long and fraught with obstacles, but she now saw a family truly reunited. Richard was no longer just a CEO, a man busy with his business and ambition. He had become an attentive, loving, and present father, capable of giving what money cannot buy: time, affection, and the emotional security of a home. In the days that followed, Richard continued his efforts, but with a newfound balance. He delegated more within his company to be able to spend time with Ethan, and every professional victory was now shared with him. Weekends became moments of complicity, walks in the park, storytelling, playing in the garden. Every laugh from Ethan was more precious to Richard than any signed contract. One evening, watching the city twinkle through the large living room windows, Richard turned to Maria and said, "Thank you, Maria, for everything you've done for him, for me. Without you, I don't think I would have understood what it means to be a real father." Maria nodded, moved but discreet. "You just needed to realize what really mattered," she replied softly. "And now you're here." Richard smiled, watching Ethan play with his toy cars on the living room rug. He understood that true wealth wasn't in his buildings, his cars, or his millions. True wealth was found in those simple moments, in his son's gaze, in the tenderness and complicity that were built day after day. For Richard Coleman, business could continue, but from now on, every decision, every action, would be guided by love and presence for his son. He understood that what matters most is not what you own, but what you share. And in that gentle late summer twilight, the Coleman family, united and reconciled, discovered the greatest lesson of all: true wealth is measured in the heart, not in the bank account.